listeners, and welcome to Get Smarter, an LCE podcast. In an earlier episode, we talked about the future of operations. This episode is going to be a bit related as we're discussing investments and risk. That's right, folks. Any improvement or expansion requires moolah, aka capital. And we're going to talk about the balance of making capital investments while managing risk throughout the life cycle of an asset. I am joined today on this episode by David Mierau. Dave Mierau is a licensed professional engineer, managing principal consultant, and senior reliability engineering expert here at Lifecycle Engineering. For over 20 years, he has held senior operations and engineering leadership positions in the pharmaceutical and discrete manufacturing industries. So, welcome to the podcast, Dave.
Thanks, Tara. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Excited to be here today to talk about this topic and, looking forward to our discussion.
Great. Well, let's jump in. A common complaint that we hear from clients and partners in the industry is about the amount of unplanned capital spend they incur each year. We'll call them surprises, right? Where a critical asset breaks down unexpectedly, and the organization has to make an unplanned replacement or a super expensive rebuild, and they hadn't budgeted for it at all in the capital process. So, Dave, what do you think are some reasons or some factors that make this a common occurrence?
So, even though you make surprises sound exciting, right?
It's not.
They're not a good thing, right? This is not a good surprise kind of scenario. So, nobody likes these kinds of surprises, right? You get the call in the middle of the night, hey, this particular piece of equipment is down. We can't get it restarted, right? These are all not fun situations to be in. Unfortunately, I've been in those quite a few times in my past. I've gotten a call in the middle of the night, hey, we've got a chiller down. It supports one of our critical operations, and we're going to have to do a temporary backup type arrangement, to keep the process running. But yeah, I think a lot of times organizations get in these situations, you get what you get in terms of investment dollars every year, right? So capital funding is always tough to come by. It's always tight. And companies have to make decisions year over year and even month to month, right? What are we going to spend our limited capital on? Something like that chiller I mentioned, I think that was even on our capital list a few times, right? Hey, this is something we need to address. We know it's getting towards the end of its operating life, but it gets pushed, right? It's not an exciting project. It's
Right.
$1 million chiller replacement. Who gets excited about that? So it gets pushed, right? And that I think is pretty common in companies where things don't make the list, right? And it just sort of gets moved out for some other things. But I think the other way to look at this, right? We think about capital in a couple different ways. As an organization or at a corporate level, you have capital portfolio management. So this is where you're looking at all the potential investments that the company may need to make with their capital. And then you have capital project management, right? That's the more smaller scope. I need to replace that chiller, or I need to replace this other piece of equipment. So, there's these really two different areas that, what we call life cycle asset management can come into play and can really help organizations out. And these are some of the things I've used in the past with a little bit of success. But, looking at the traditional things of what's the ROI on this investment? What's the simple payback? What's the internal rate of return, right? Those are typical things that organizations look at when they're thinking of capital investments and
In
what to invest
budgeting.
in. Yeah, in budgeting, exactly. Um, when you take a little bit more of a life cycle asset management approach, looking at the big picture, the goal is really to proactively get ahead of these surprises, and avoid them, right? Avoid the bad surprises. And, in addition to just being interruptions, right? You've got the downtime cost, you've got the potential safety issues, the compliance issues, right? So there's a lot of things that, okay, yeah, it's an interruption, but there's also potentially other risks to the organization when these things happen.
Right. So it's not only looking at those financial aspects of the capital planning, capital budgeting process, but then thinking about it from a larger reliability and other cost aspects or cost avoidance aspects that should be considered in your decision making. So can you explain or talk to me a little bit more about life cycle asset management?
Sure. Yeah, so this is a topic I think maybe some organizations don't really think about from an asset centric point of view, right? They may think of projects, right? Or they may
Right.
think of capital portfolio that I mentioned, right? Here's all the different things that are on our list. What do we want to do? But when you look at it more from an asset centric point of view, when I have a particular asset, right, and I have a project idea, hey, I need a new production line or something like that, right? That's a concept, and typically from a concept, you work your way into some sort of detailed design process where
Hmm.
engineering gets involved. You're doing some equipment selection. You're putting together very traditional engineering design drawings, layouts, etc. And then you go into your build or installation phase through procurement, right? Commissioning and qualification. Then you get to the big operate and maintain phase, which is where a lot of us live, right? When the asset is operating and maintain, you're
Creating
maintaining it.
value.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, right. That's when the value essentially is being delivered. Exactly. Um, and then eventually, right, as the asset ages, and even if you're maintaining it well, you get to these points where you need to decide, okay, do we need to look at refurbishing an asset? Do we need to look at replacing it? And then, beyond that point, potentially it's a decommissioning or retirement phase for that asset. But, essentially looking at things from a concept through design, through commissioning and qualification is sort of one piece of the asset life cycle. And then you have that
Hmm.
operate and maintain, as well as the refurbish replacement decision making. That's a little more to the back end of the asset life cycle. Um, but having that holistic view, I think, is really important because you want to make sure you have an understanding and a clear picture, right, for what activities are your support teams doing, right? What are your engineers working on during those early phases of an asset life cycle, right? When you're going through the conceptual design and the procurement activities and the factory acceptance testing, and then what activities are happening during the operate and maintain phase, right? That's where a lot
Right.
of focus. But if you're a project engineer, you're focused a lot on those early phases. So, some questions to ask are, do you know how old your assets are? Do you know what their expected life is? When you look at a list of assets within your organization, do you feel like you have a good handle on, well, this particular asset has a couple years left, or does it have a couple decades left, of its operating life?
Right. Right.
You know,
What kind of physical condition are they in, and how is that related to the life cycle phase of the asset, as well as how it connects to daily operations, right? So,
correct. Yes. And
yeah.
I think it's also important, to keep in context what's the big picture of the site or the organization
Right.
in terms of, are you expanding your operation, right? Are you capacity constrained where everything that you make is sold, right? There's a lot of companies
Mm-hmm.
in that situation today.
Mm-hmm.
There's others that are just looking to maintain their current level of output or their current level of service. And then there's others that maybe for whatever reason are on more of a decreasing trend and they're moving on to other products or other services, right? So I think it's important not just to understand where your asset is in its life cycle and its condition, but also where's the organization from a strategic perspective in terms of growth versus maintaining its current level of output versus are things winding down in this particular area where the asset resides.
Wow, I mean, that is a lot to consider. So we just went from looking at things from strictly a project management or portfolio management perspective to thinking about the larger view of the asset life cycle to thinking about the strategic outlook of the organization and how all that's connected. You just made this really important. Thank you.
Good.
Um, so let's go back down into some details. Um, let's talk about some of the capital projects that you've been involved with or had experience with, successful and not so successful maybe. Um, what would you say are the top 3 to 4 things that companies are doing that increase the likelihood of some large capital project surprises? So these would be the things that you don't really want to continue doing. Talk to me about a couple of those things, please.
Yeah, so in terms of things that, you don't want to get in the rut of, right? You don't want to find yourself in these situations, but um, it's real easy for organizations and sites to get excited about these growth projects, right? So, hey, we've got a new product coming in and we need to put a new production line in, or there's this new technology that we want to deploy, right? Those are things that are really easy to get excited about, right? And everybody wants to work on those, right? They're promotion opportunities. They're great publicity for the company even or the organization. What's not as exciting, unfortunately, is hey, we need to replace this 20-year-old air handling unit or this 30
Right.
boiler, right? Those aren't making headlines, right? They're not as exciting, but when that happens and you're looking at your capital portfolio and you're making decisions based on, do I replace the boiler that's 30 years old, or do I work on this new exciting technology deployment,
Expansion,
right?
yeah.
People are going to go the exciting route typically. So what they'll convince themselves of is, right, well, this boiler's operated for 30 years. Can't it go one more year, right? How about we got this really important initiative right now and we have to work on it. So let's just defer that for one more year, right? And they essentially convince themselves that it's okay, it's going to make it another year. But that's where people start to get in trouble, right? That's where organizations get in trouble when the one more year becomes the year, right? Like I mentioned that
Sure.
chiller earlier. I think that chiller was on that capital list for several years, right? With exactly that
Sure.
same thinking, unfortunately. Um, and if you're taking a diligent approach to this, right? Companies, they don't need to invest a lot in maintenance capital, right? If they're focusing on it regularly on a year over year basis. But if you start deferring things too long, the maintenance capital is going to start to take over your overall capital portfolio because you defer, defer, and defer. And then, right, all of these little problems start adding up to big problems.
Big
And now,
problems.
yeah, you don't just have one or two assets that are an issue. Now you've got 10 or a dozen or more assets that are an issue. So, I think being very diligent through that capital portfolio management activity, when you're
Right.
typically in your business planning, right? That's when you want to look at data that you have available and information that you have available, whether it's condition monitoring trends, whether it's maintenance trends, it could be cost, could be labor hours.
Right.
These are all things that should feed into
Or the
these
amount of
decisions.
deferred maintenance that you have, the maintenance that you haven't been doing.
Exactly. Exactly. Yes. So if the organization understands, hey, we've knowingly been deferring this because of cost reduction reasons or cost management purposes, you need to keep track of that, right? Because people change roles as well. And, the person who was managing that for a couple of years may say, well, next year we're for sure going to do this. And then, sure enough, they move on to another role and then the clock resets, right? So,
Right.
keeping a close eye on that, but using data and having a way to manage that information so that you're making an informed decision rather than sort of a gut feel decision when you're looking at your capital investments is really critical, and making sure you have high quality data feeding into those processes.
To put the heat on the risk factor,
Yes,
because that's the turning point, right? That's the where the not so exciting projects may become the no, we really need to do projects, right? So, um, well, thank you for that. And let's continue talking about because we started to a little bit, but about considering both the the maintenance and the investment capital. We started to talk about growth capital and maintenance capital, but um, let's go ahead and dig a little bit deeper into that and talk about more of those financial terms, the ROIs, the net present value, which personally I kind of understand, but not really.
sure. No, it's an important concept, and I think looking at your capital investments, and maybe trying to bucket them into a couple different areas, right? I mentioned
Hmm.
maintenance capital earlier, right? Maintenance capital maybe is considered the less exciting of the two, right? But it's necessary. And there's some savvy investors out there that will look for that type of information, and other stakeholders, right? Executives and the boards of organizations, right? They're looking at, well, how much of our investments are going towards maintenance capital
Right.
versus growth, right? And I
To
think
keep what we have and not just continuing to push, but to maintain, the assets that are currently delivering value.
exactly, and that is the definition of maintenance capital, right? The definition of that is this is what I need to invest year over year just to maintain my current level of operation, right? It's maybe nothing additional. Maybe you get some minor efficiency gains out of a new piece of equipment versus an older technology, but the growth capital piece, is something that is more focused on production increases or throughput
Hmm.
increases or service level increases. And if you're working on this year over year and you're diligent about it, your maintenance capital doesn't have to be a huge percentage of your overall investment. It can be less than 1% even of your annual revenue. And that's okay, right? It doesn't need to be a huge number. The overall portfolio is typically 3 to 4% of your annual revenue. But if you're not investing in that regularly in the maintenance capital side of things, it'll eventually catch up to you, right? And then it's
Mm-hmm.
slowly going to need to be more and more of a percentage of your overall capital investment. So, in terms of the return on investment or the net present value piece of things, right? The NPV. Um, Sometimes the NPV on an asset replacement doesn't look great financially. It could
Right.
even break even, or it could even be a loss, from a net present value perspective or a return on investment. So the other reason it's important to combine these things in your overall portfolio, the growth and the maintenance, is the growth projects can often surpass, right, in terms of net present value or return on investment, and essentially fund some of the compliance or the maintenance capital things that you need to do. So if
Oh,
the end,
isn't that a nice reciprocation?
it's a,
How
it's a nice way to
kind.
look
How
at it.
nice.
Yeah, you look at it bigger picture, right? And then it doesn't all of a sudden look like a bunch of losing projects, right? Big
Right.
picture. When you combine it with the good things, now overall your investments are positive, right? Because the really good stuff is making up for the things that aren't necessarily generating lots and lots of value for the organization. Um, the other thing that probably doesn't get looked at enough and doesn't get enough time is this concept of design for reliability. So when you,
Yes, talk to me about that.
yeah, so when you hear this term, I think it means maybe something a little different to different people, and it's typically focused in those early phases of the asset life cycle. So all the way back to what type of equipment are you selecting? part of your detailed design process.
Right.
Even through commissioning and qualification, you can catch things. But the whole purpose of design for reliability is to have a very deep understanding of all the different ways an asset can fail, uh,
Yes.
all of its different causes of failure modes, and making
Mm-hmm.
sure you have very robust maintenance plans in place to address those causes. So it could be very traditional time-based preventive maintenance. You could have condition monitoring. You could have online condition monitoring, or in our world today, asset performance management with some AI incorporated. All of these things need to address specific failure modes. But if you're not evaluating those failure modes from the very beginning, you're always going to be playing sort of this catch-up game
Be
where
behind.
you
Yeah.
catch up with these failures,
And
that are
have the not so good surprises. They'll be all
exactly.
around.
Exactly. Yeah. If your root cause analysis is great, right? And you need to do that for sure once you're into the operate maintain phase of the life cycle.
Right.
But trying to prevent those events in the first place is a little bit of time and a little bit of investment in that regard can save huge things down the road because it could lead to a slightly different equipment selection. And even though the equipment is a little more costly on the front end, it saves you a lot of money on the back end once it's in that 10, 20, 30 years of operation. So that design for reliability piece, understanding the details of equipment failure and making
Yes.
sure you have these robust maintenance plans in place can't overstate the importance of that. That's a really critical concept here that feeds into both your capital project management primarily,
Mm-hmm.
but
Mm-hmm.
also big picture, right? It makes your capital portfolio look better as well, not just that individual project, because as you're doing those things well systemically across multiple projects, it all adds up for value at the portfolio level.
Right. So you should theoretically, if you're designing for reliability and, doing your failure modes, effects analysis, pre-operation, et cetera, you should be able to not only have an understanding of the overall maintenance um, ecosystem or whatever, the variety of maintenance strategies that will best serve you, but it's life cycle cost management as well. So it's not only the asset, the physical, asset management, but also the costs that are involved. You could have that an understanding of that in those early phases of the life cycle, which
Exactly.
is,
Yeah.
yeah,
That's that
very
concept of TCO, or total cost of
total
ownership.
cost of ownership.
Exactly.
Right.
Initial investment, but then it's everything else during its life cycle that you need to invest in, which can be a combination of capital expenditure as well as operational expenditure as well.
So, Dave, for someone who's interested in how they can get started adding a lifecycle asset management mindset to their current strategic capital planning process, what would you recommend?
So I think there's a few different things to look at here. There's some things within your teams that you need to look at, but there's actually quite a few different groups that I think can help in these situations. And some of them may be things that, are common knowledge, some of them maybe not so much. So, I think the first thing to do is think about, what's your understanding of your critical assets? Do you understand the difference between the levels of risk that assets present to your organization? So, if you have an office air handling unit that serves administrative space, right? When that type of asset fails, it's never a fun thing, right? It still could be bad. People could be
It's
uncomfortable,
an
but
inconvenience, yeah.
exactly. But you're not stopping production, right? The financial impact to the organization is typically not very high, right? When that type of failure occurs. Now, if you're talking about a production asset or an asset that a large portion of your revenue or throughput goes through, that's a
Hmm.
whole different story, right? That now you have a large impact to the organization when that asset fails. And those are what we would call critical assets. So we like to stratify all the different assets within an organization into different levels of criticality. So where this comes into play, right, is more critical assets, whether it's a growth opportunity or whether it's a maintenance opportunity, those need to really have first consideration, right, for your capital investments at your organization. So that's really the first thing to consider. And that's an activity typically accomplished within the engineering teams, but you need to include other stakeholders in that. You need to include business counterparts, so from the finance team, safety and quality, and all these different teams that have different aspects of risk, right? Not
Right.
just downtime or not just financial, but the safety aspects, the environmental aspects. So criticality is a multifaceted concept, but it's very important to understand relative to each other how your assets stack up and compare within your particular site or your organization. Um,
Right.
yeah, so and then totally different sort of gear here, right? Well, working with your financial teams. Um, have a conversation with someone from your financial group, and do they even consider the difference between growth capital and maintenance capital? Are you
Mm,
even looking at that today, right? Do you understand, okay, of what we're investing in maintenance capital, is it increasing? Is it decreasing? Are we holding it flat? Um, do they understand the trend of unplanned capital spending, which typically falls into that maintenance bucket,
sure.
even if it's retrospective, right? So, not just from a plan perspective, but what happened recently or what happened this past
What
quarter
were
or
our
the year.
surprises? Exactly.
Yeah, total of the surprises financially. And, you know, are your financial teams looking at that today? Are they tracking it? Those are really good questions to ask because they can help, right, with avoiding the surprises through different methods and different processes, like we've been talking about here with the analysis piece, the design for reliability piece, as well as understanding the reliability analytics if you're
Yes.
in the operate maintain phase, right? Um, so, I think looking within your own organization and understanding what's the recent trend, right? What's my recent unplanned capital trend? And if you have some concerns, right? If you have some things that show up on that list, then ask yourself, what are you doing today from a life cycle asset management perspective? Are there processes that you could put in place? Are there some evaluation activities like the failure mode assessment, right, to develop a failure mode based maintenance strategy rather than just taking whatever the equipment manufacturer says and implementing that. Um, and then doing that cost comparison really between the proactive asset management, right, versus your actual, the avoidable costs, essentially to
Right.
help prove your point, right? Hey, we need to do things differently. And I've ran some numbers. And here's what this would have looked like if we would have taken more of a design for reliability or a life cycle asset management approach versus just waiting for the issues to happen, the surprises to occur. Um, and I think a word that fits really well with lifecycle asset management is stability. And stability is something investors like. If you're a publicly traded organization, investors don't like surprises. And if you have
Volatility would be the
right, the
opposite,
volatility
right?
is bad. It's common, unfortunately, today, but it's still a bad thing from an investor perspective, right? Investors and stakeholders in general, right? Even your board for your organization, they want to see stable uh, operations. They want to see stable financial performance. If you say we're going to spend this much capital on these things, that's what
Hmm.
they want to see at the end of your fiscal year, that you did what you said you were going to do, right? Those are really the important concepts here. Stabilization, both from an operational perspective and from a financial perspective. Lifecycle asset management helps both. And it helps both the engineering and operational aspect of things, but also the financial piece. Um, and if this seems a little daunting, right? If it seems like, oh my gosh, where do I start? This is a big deal. I need to create processes and procedures and standards, right? There's help available, certainly. But also start with one asset. Start with one department or
A
start with
critical
one.
asset. We want to make sure that we know
Exactly.
that.
Exactly. So look at what's critical, understand that first, and then maybe start there, right? Pick your
Hmm.
top 5 critical assets in your organization and prove the concept out, refine the things that you want to do. Maybe you don't have to do everything we've talked about here, but start to get some things in place with condition assessments or look at current maintenance trends or your bad actor list and start to incorporate those into your capital management discussions. Those are good places to start, at least from a overall life cycle asset management and capital management perspective.
I really think that's excellent advice, Dave. Thank you so much. And to summarize, if I can, lifecycle asset management can help stabilize your company's capital management approach and help minimize, identify and minimize risk of unplanned expenditures. And you can, if you have that mindset, if you start installing that mindset, it's going to help you get more of the desired benefits that you want for your not only your critical assets already in operation, your existing assets, but new assets too, with that design for reliability perspective, and that you don't have to, just start with one critical asset. If this is not something that's currently um, installed in your organization, or it's not a common awareness of all those stakeholders that we talked about before: engineering, safety, finance, maintenance, operations, the whole kit and caboodle. Um, but it's also uh, help is there, and the to have someone help refine your processes with life cycle asset management in mind. So you don't have to do this alone. That there is help out there too. Um, well, I want to thank you so much for this discussion today. I had a great time. Thank you for joining us on the podcast. And we kind of hit on it, but I wanted to have one more final thought, if you would. One final thought that you'd like to leave with our audience today regarding positive impact of applying lifecycle asset management mindset to capital planning.
Sure, I think maybe think about the tools that your organization is using today. Do
Mm.
you have design for reliability tools? Do you have reliability analytical tools, reliability analytics in the operate and maintain phase of the asset lifecycle? What sort of tools are you deploying today?
Even a way to assess asset criticality, right? Like
Exactly.
even.
Even the beginning phase of asset criticality, right? All of these things are going to contribute when you're ready to tackle life cycle asset management. And just starting with some of those fundamentals
Mm.
and some of the basic tools, I think are easy steps to at least get started. And you can work your way into the bigger picture. You can work your way into the financial discussion and the capital portfolio management discussion, right? Those are big, high level executive discussions. And if you're not ready to immediately go there, start with the sphere of influence that you have and look at start implementation of tools such as the failure mode effects analysis
Mm.
and the
Hmm.
technical tools that you can use to provide information to those decision makers to start to help stabilize the operation. And if you hear concerns, hey, how can we avoid these surprises? How can we avoid this unplanned downtime? Go to your toolbox, get some help, understand here's the right things to implement first, and here's the
Hmm.
right critical assets to implement initially with. So those are all things I think that we want everyone to think about, immediately after this, right? Okay, if I'm going to go do something with this, where can I start today, and what are some simple tools I can start using to head in this direction?
Well, I think that that is great guidance, and makes it not so insurmountable. This is something that you can do with tools that are in your current sphere of influence and control. So that's empowering. This has been a great podcast. And so, listeners, if you'd like to explore more about the topic, head to lc.com. We'll provide some resources in the podcast episode show notes. But also, you could search in our resources library and find some of these tools and some guidance along the lines of design for reliability, the foundations like criticality analysis and FMEA, and capital planning, and some of the other things that we discussed in our podcast today. So thanks again, Dave, so much for joining us. And thank you, listeners, for joining us too. And until we see you next time, let's stay smarter, people.